Hello, SOCA1010 students. I'm here this week to talk to you about media and popular culture. So, I this week you'll see some things in this lecture that you're already somewhat familiar with. We're going to be touching upon the work of Bourdieu again, and I know many of you just completed your podcast on the question that drew on Bourdieu's work. So hopefully this will be something of a refresher to that, but not necessarily new information. And then some of what I cover will be a bit newer. So especially the theories of the media, theories of media affect and such. That will be some new information, and importantly, I think it'll be helpful for many of you who are thinking of writing on the media question for the essay. I know that's a really popular one, so do look out and pay attention to some of the media theories that I'll talk about in the final part of this lecture. I think they could be really helpful for introducing theory into your essay in a way that is very focused and targeted on the actual topic you're addressing in your essay. So, I'm going to start off by talking a bit about culture, popular culture, and then I'll talk about the media, and then finally media effects or theories of the media. And so to start with popular culture, as we've kind of discussed or touched on a bit so far in this course, culture really broadly refers to beliefs, values, behavior, material objects, and how all of these things come together to form someone's way of life. So culture is not one specific thing. Culture is formed by everything around us. It's distinguishable through how we interact with each other, what we surround ourselves with, what we believe, the specific values we have around things like cultural differences are discernible when you consider how different people might view the role of children in caring for parents in later life, whether it would be most appropriate or most desirable for older parents to live with their adult children or for older parents to live in a kind of care facility with other people of their age. The perspective on which one of those is normal and desirable is it's down to a lot of things, but part of it is a difference in culture. So that's one example of many ways in which culture is discernible, and especially it's an example of how culture determines our perspective on the world around us. It determines how we see the world, the values that we place upon it, how we would interpret a social situation, or what we would necessarily think about what is the right thing to do in the situation, what is the expected course of action. And culture includes the kind of traditions that we inherit and pass on to the next generation. So when we talk about a process of inculcation, that's generally, culture is something that's passed on to us during socialization. So we learn cultural traditions and expectations during primary, secondary, and tertiary processes of socialization. We learn a lot about culture and tradition from our families, and we then, will most likely pass it on to children or members of the next generation that we interact with. And so the definition of culture that I'm putting forward here is really quite broad, but culture can also be very specific in a lot of ways. Culture can be very kind of, very niche. So I'm going to talk to you about some different forms of culture, and the distinction that I'm using here, since we're focusing on media and popular culture this week, is the distinction between high culture and popular culture. So high culture is considered things like classical music, opera, ballet, live theatre, any of those types of things that have traditionally been patronized by elite audiences, so people from members of the upper class, upper middle class, who have the amount of time, money, knowledge, who supposedly are able to fully appreciate these things. So personally, the ability to appreciate opera is beyond me. I think it is potentially something that you would have to grow up with, or perhaps learn to appreciate. Some of you may feel differently about that. Maybe that's one to discuss in the tutorials if we have any opera aficionados among us. And so, in contrast to high culture, popular culture is intended to be the kinds of activities, products, and services that are assumed or intended to appeal primarily to members of the middle and working classes, so the kind of broad base of society. So this would be things, a contemporary example would be superhero movies. Like any kind of blockbuster movie, by its very definition, that type of film relies on the ability to get people into the cinema and have a good kind of first box office weekend, remake the cost of the film through like ticket sales and such. So by its very definition, it needs to appeal to a large number of people rather than a small minority of people. And you can generally kind of discern the degree to which something is intended to be part of high culture versus popular culture through looking at its accessibility. So is it something that anyone who can get to a cinema could go and see, or is it something where you would have to go to this one theatre in a capital city and tickets are really expensive and you would have to book for like months in advance some of the time? You might not know about it. It might be that you would most of the time need to be a member of a certain kind of theatre or organisation to know tickets were going to go on sale. So, and the accessibility of the aspects of culture is a good kind of shorthand for trying to understand whether something's intended to be high culture or popular culture. So here's some examples, different ways of consuming alcohol. So the champagne being kind of sprayed over the race cars is an example of a kind of popular culture, mass culture experience of alcohol. And I would assume that many people in the audience here probably like have a beer in their hand, whereas wine is generally associated with a kind of a higher culture. But interestingly, the kind of cultural value of wine, or the degree to which wine is associated with high culture, is really down to how it's consumed. So we have the example here of the guy with the like the converted kind of beer hat thing, who's consuming wine in this very stereotypically like low culture, pop culture kind of way. Like it's a clear reference to the beer hat thing. And then in contrast to that, we have some wine appreciators who sit there amongst the vineyards, like looking at the the hue of the wine, looking at its color, smelling the wine. So there's a type of performance around appreciating wine as an aspect of high culture. And there's a kind of necessary knowledge that goes behind that. So it's necessary to know enough about wine to be able to choose wine that demonstrates like this is a good quality wine rather than like a house white. So not even just kind of types of alcohol necessarily, but we can see aspects of high culture and popular culture in the consumption practices around these different types of wine, whether someone's looking at its colors in a vineyard, or spraying champagne all over a supercar. So interestingly, cultural commodities products are generally designed to appeal to as many people as possible. And this is generally because, much like the kind of popular culture cinema and such, it's necessary to have a broad market base so that you can sell enough of your product to break even and then hopefully make a profit. Like it's just kind of business sense. But a large proportion of products are actually rejected by the people that would be, you know, sought after to consume them. So trying to design a product that's going to appeal to, a broad market base is actually really difficult. And we can see that in, you know, again, going back to films as an example, we can see when we look at the whether films do really well at the box office versus whether they're deemed to be a flop and not do so well, it's hard to predict which way things are going to go. So, something like the Hunger Games series did really well, and that that spawned a bunch of similar films and franchises, the kind of young adult dystopian trend, and eventually those films weren't doing so well a lot of the time. Kind of similar films such as the Divergent films. And it's really difficult to try and pin down, why did these films do well and these ones didn't? Like, why was this particular film such a breakaway hit and this one wasn't? I think you could imagine if you were, marketing executives who were trying to choose whether films were going to be greenlit based on whether they'll be predicted to actually do well and make back the money that was invested in creating them, you'd be tearing your hair out because it's really difficult to say what's actually going to do well. There's some kind of ingredients that seem to tip the scales towards it probably doing well, but there's no guarantees. So what this tells us is that there's really no universal standards or selection criteria for what's going to sell well. And people working within marketing have always been looking for what would be called socially located criteria of relevance. So, what is interesting? What's cool? What are people interested in? Is it young adult dystopian? Is it superhero films? Is it, socially conscious horror films? Like, what is the kind of genre, or what are the socially located criteria of relevance? What are the boxes that need to be ticked? So people in marketing are always trying to figure this out because it's clearly something of a moving feast. It's not, popular culture is not something that stands still. It changes over time. It makes and remakes itself. So for this reason, quite a lot of the kind of online profiles that we make on like social media sites and such, well, they're used in many cases to kind of try to target cultural products and advertisements that will actually be appealing to you based on where you are deemed to fit within these socially located criteria of relevance, how your personal profile maps onto the consumption profile of someone who's living in Newcastle, who's 20 years old, who's a young woman, who is at university. That would suggest that you would hopefully like a certain range of things. Maybe you would like a certain stationery company. I don't know, that's incredibly lame, but I'm sure you can think of way better examples than that. But essentially, there's an effort to identify what do these different groups like, and then market towards that to create popular culture. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that popular culture, it's often presented as being something really kind of simple and dumbed down, like mass entertainment, but it's incredibly complicated and it's really difficult to create, popular culture items that actually do well. So, and some examples of popular culture in Australian society, especially I think one of the biggest ones is watching sport. So, there's a lot of kind of cultural significance associated with the types of sports that you watch, knowledge of sports, which team you go for. That can be a large part of kind of personal identity. It can also help you to connect with other people that you're spending time with. For instance, when I was younger, I'm from Victoria, so AFL is the really big one down there. I think obviously people still watch AFL up here, but I think it's really rugby that's the kind of main focus, or at least that's the sense that I've gotten. So when I was at my first ever job, I was working at a restaurant, and there was the staff had like a footy tipping competition, and I always felt like I was kind of outside of their popular culture appreciation, because I don't really watch football and I don't really understand it super well. My family was never into it, so they kind of cursed me to a lifetime of non-footy appreciation. And so, the the appreciation of the same elements of popular culture and the ability to, buy into and collectively enjoy popular culture around sport in that way was a really big kind of bonding thing for everyone at my workplace apart from me. So, that was very much popular culture intersecting with identity. As I've already mentioned, another really big part of Australian culture, especially, is alcohol. So you can think about the specific types of alcohol that are often consumed, the types that you would buy, the types that you think, no, that's not really something that's directed at me. The different types of alcohol you would associate with different groups of people. Yeah, and then I think another one that's quite interesting is reality TV. So at the moment, I know it's finished now, but flash back to a month or a couple of months ago. If you think about the incredible popularity of something like Married at First Sight, and how that was probably the topic of many like water cooler conversations, many casual conversations with acquaintances, like at work or at uni. And that was something of a kind of common pop culture glue that united us all in not liking the guy whose name escapes me, but the really unpleasant man on the latest series of it. So essentially, the point that I'm making here in a really long-winded way is that popular culture is really important for the many ways that we make meaning in Australian society. It's important for giving us some common points of reference to interact with each other. It gives us some kind of common activities to rally around, and it gives us ways of kind of shaping personal identity within a popular culture affiliation. The best example I can think of this is again football. So you can all appreciate and enjoy football or rugby or whatever the big sport is, and yet go for different teams, and you can still kind of be united in your enjoyment of that, but still have a kind of a point of difference by going for these different teams or having different kind of favorite players. So the point that I'm making really is that popular culture is kind of everything. It's everywhere. It's really all around us. And one of the things that I've kind of been talking around that comes back a little bit to some of the things that we've already covered in this course is how our appreciation of and enjoyment of and affiliation with certain types of popular culture can tell other people a lot about us. So coming back to Bourdieu on this topic, we have his very, very famous quote that taste classifies and it classifies the classifier. Social subjects classified by their classifications distinguish themselves by the distinctions they make between the beautiful and the ugly, between the distinguished and the vulgar, and in which their position in the objective classifications is expressed or betrayed. And so that's a very complicated and long-winded way of saying that essentially your cultural tastes and what you like and why, they give away a lot about you. They can give away your social background. So, if you say, for instance, "Hi, I'm Julia and I like wine and I'm potentially a bit of a closet Married at First Sight fan," that might tell you quite a bit about my own social background, my own positioning within a schema of taste. So, I know you've already covered the body's work on economic and cultural capital, but I think it is worth kind of revisiting in light of our conversation around popular culture and the kind of distinction between popular culture and high culture, and how different forms of cultural appreciation say more about us than they do about what we like. They're a clear giveaway of our own background and where we've come from. So, if you remember, economic capital basically refers to money and assets, and then cultural capital refers to kind of cultural knowledge. So, our kind of knowledge of like what is cool and what is trendy. And so it's very possible to have a lot of money but not much of what we would call taste. So this goes to the understanding of the idea of a kind of cashed up bogan, someone that has a lot of money but hasn't accumulated the corresponding cultural capital, and is so therefore seen as still being somewhat lower class, even though they are financially very well off. So examples of this, if you look across this schema, which I think is really well done, it's talking about taste in food, which is always a great indication. So we can see for someone who has lots of money but not too much kind of cultural capital, they're likely to go to a steakhouse or like a brunch buffet, things that are seen as being somewhat declass, like expensive but somewhat like cringy almost. Or things that those that have high cultural capital were maybe interested in or liked 10 or 15 years ago. And then if we look at the other side of things, someone who has not much money but lots of cultural capital is quite likely to go to like food trucks, which that relies on having knowledge of how to find food trucks and knowing which food trucks are going to be where when. So it's relying on this underground cultural knowledge, or probably more likely the ability to find a Facebook page. And we have all these like DIY things, which again rely on knowledge of how to do things, making preserves and sauerkraut and like pickling things, fermenting things. And like the stakes are quite high here, because I know if you do some of this stuff wrong, you can basically poison yourself. So you'd really want to be very confident in your cultural knowledge if you're pickling things, not one to try at home. Yeah, so the final example, which I thought was really interesting, is how aspects of high culture can essentially filter into popular culture over time. So just as we can think of this particular chart as being something of a continuum where steakhouse dinners and brunch buffets and such and business meals were, and things like foie gras and truffle oil were potentially a bit more kind of had a bit more cultural cachet in the past and are now seen as being a bit like overdone and such. Like we can see that's kind of a filtering of things from a kind of high culture to a low culture, and we can see how that's happened in something like the kind of cultural representation of the periodic table of elements. So I thought this was a really fun article from the conversation. Essentially, I think they were a chemist describing how the periodic table has been used from its kind of classic design to its use in popular culture. So clearly, the periodic table in times past was an aspect of high culture by virtue of the fact that it was used by people with elite forms of knowledge. And over time, there's been a kind of filtering of the periodic table into kind of more common use. So we can see an example of it being a kind of background spread in, I think that's the Big Bang Theory. And we have like periodic table elements on like coffee mugs, and there's different kind of designs, and there's songs about it. And so we can see this as part of a wider push towards democratizing and mainstreaming science in general, and trying to kind of bring scientific knowledge into the kind of wider population. And we can see it as a maybe part of like widening participation in education, especially higher education. So it's it's an aspect of popular culture that's emblematic of a range of really interesting social shifts that have brought this really boring kind of stuffy thing into the kind of realm of popular culture, and have made it into a shared kind of fun, quirky point of reference that we can all recognize. So I'm going to leave this here for now, and then we can reconvene and have a look at the media. But if you'd like, have a look at the conversation article and learn something new about the periodic table.